Well, welcome everyone to the Thompson Free Library's presentation of The Lowering Days with author Greg Brown. I'm John Knepp. I'm the director at the library, and I'd like to introduce you to Greg Brown. But first, I just wanted to say the chat is open, so if you do have any questions, you can always put a question in the chat. We're going to get to a question and answer at the end of the talk. And everyone is muted, but we'll have questions at the end. You can either raise your hand or put something in the chat if you'd like to ask a question. So, welcome everyone. This is Greg Brown. He's a fairly local Maine author. He grew up in Belfast. He's currently living a little further west in Maine right now. He's a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. His stories have appeared in Tin House, the Alaska Quarterly Review, Shenandoah, Epoch, and Narrative Magazine. And his debut novel, The Lowering Days, is out now through HarperCollins. And you can read a lot of praise for it online, but I really like my wife's review best. She's in the audience today. She said, "I slowed down reading this book because I wanted to spend more time in this world." So I thought that was pretty short and concise. If you want to read what Richard Rousseau has to say about it, it's on the back of the book. But, you know, there's only so many ways you can say it, and I really like the way Kasia put it. So welcome, Greg. Shoot, I have to unmute Greg. Sorry about this. I love Zoom. Oh, wait, I clicked the wrong button.
Okay, so that was totally my fault, by the way. Thank you, John, for the lovely welcome. I muted myself just so when you were introducing, like, you know, there wouldn't be any background noise, and I forgot that we had that, you know, you have to be asked to unmute feature set up for the next.
Yeah.
Thank you for the welcome. Thank you for having me. It's good to see everybody out there. And yeah, your wife's review is kind of like the best compliment in ways for a writer. Just anytime somebody wants to stay in the world of your book, I mean, it's really touching. I know how hard that is too. Like when you're enjoying a book, to actually actively slow down and linger in it can be really difficult. So,
yep.
Like I respect her, you know, intentionality around that. Yeah.
Yep. So the first question is right off the bat. I think the biggest thing about this book that I took out of it was the sense of place and how that plays into the book. And so could you describe a little bit what a sense of place, what role that plays in the book and exactly where it's set and how that figures into the story?
Yeah, absolutely. So the novel is set in a fictionalized version of the Penobscot River Valley. You know, I've always kind of talked about it as a Maine of my imagination, which it is in many ways. At the same time, it draws on very real elements of Maine. There's references to geographic places that the readers will recognize. Maine's history, its cultural history, its political history, as it's put out in the book, is accurate or factual to our real Maine that we know in most ways. So for me, I mean, I grew up, like you said, in Belfast, and my dad's family stayed like really intact in Waldo County, and my mom's family stayed really intact over time in Penobscot County. So I spent like so much of my young life going up and down from the bay to the river, and just kind of moving between, you know, the lower end of the river valley and the bay itself. And when I started writing fiction, I found that, like, for many people, you know, it begins with character or concept, and that sometimes is the case for me, but it often starts with place. I was always really interested in bringing land to life, and also kind of not only bringing it to life, but looking at the interplay between a landscape and the human lives that it holds. So for me, you know, to hear it called a novel of place is like a great compliment. And I find too that when it comes to like almost all of my fiction, not all of it, but most of it is set in Maine. I've written quite a bit of short fiction before The Lowering Days was published, and I continue to return really specifically to, you know, this area of Maine, in which Dover Foxcroft is very much a part in many ways.
Yeah, we're a little bit west of.
Little bit, but not.
Yeah.
It's funny. I spent a lot of time as a child going up to Brooks and further up to Dover Foxcroft too. So yeah, it's a place in a landscape that I've been building for a long time in my imagination. And for the purpose of like the Loring Days, all of the characters are deeply invested in place too. Like echoes of time kind of come through. Each family in the book has its own kind of mythography or mythology, and those are often tied to places that feel kind of sacred or feel more alive for different families. For quick context, the book follows the intersection of three families in that area. The Ames family, the father is a boat builder, and the mother, Fallon, runs a small town newspaper called the Loring Days. Then there's the Creel family, which is, their neighbors and the family they kind of come directly into feud with. And then the third family is Molly and Adam Greenwood, who are Penobscot father and daughter, who are living a little further up the river.
Do you think that a story like this, like the one you've written here, do you think it could have taken place anywhere else, or there have been major differences? Or do you think it's something that's very, very specific to the area? Or do you think it's something more universal to other rural areas in the country?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think that the way the characters connect to the land and the cultural history that the characters carry with them, whether it's, Penobscot culture, or whether it's, Scots-Irish culture, or whether it's French or French-Canadian culture, those are those are unique in ways to Maine. Some of the issues at the front of the book, what it means to treat land as something that one can own, what it means to try to control land, what it means to rely on land for industry. We see those playing out in other places in the country for sure. And I think that at the heart of the Loring Days at times is this interplay of, my family needs to make a living, so I go into working at a mill, or I go into the fishery. And, in many ways, like, those are positive things, and I form an identity around those industries, but at the same time, like, we're exploiting and being extractive of the earth in a damaging way. And I think that kind of reliance on harming the earth in order to make money to feed our families is something we see in tons of American towns. So in some ways, I think it's a particular rural or small town drama that could manifest in many places.
Okay. Something else that came up to me while I was reading is that there are many layers and layers of different stories and storytellers in the book. So obviously, you're the author of the book, you're telling your own story, but then one layer down, it's about a newspaper in town. So that's another level of storytelling. And then there's also people, there's rumors flying around town, stories going, below the newspaper, just flying around town. And then there's the interplay between the characters. Was that something you had in mind when you were writing the book, of all of those layers? In addition, I forgot to mention the indigenous mythology that's also a big part of the book. So there's 4, 5, 6 individual layers of the story going on all at the same time. Was that something you envisioned the entire time you were writing the book, and the interplay of those?
It was, in many ways. There's a line pretty early in the book where Fallon, the narrator of the book, the primary narrator is David Almer Ames. He's Fallon's youngest son. And there's a line early in the book where Fallon thinks to herself, she believes that if you look close enough at one single story, you can see the entire unfolding of human history there. All of the conflicts that can carry down. So that belief that even the simplest stories broaden out to include many, many more stories is at the heart of Fallon's character, and it's at the heart of what I was trying to do with the book too. What I find is, like, we look at places and we look at families and we look at the way stories function, and I always feel like a story is a circle that's nested inside another container, right? There's the story of the area. There's then the story of the people in the area. There's the story of the industry in the area. Then we narrow down, and there's the story of a small town and a community, and the tales they tell themselves. Within that small town, you go to the individual family unit, and each family has kind of their own history and their own objective stories, and then their own kind of myths and family stories they make up. And within those family stories, all the individual parts have to figure out where they fit and what they're bringing to kind of their family's tale. So this idea of story nesting inside story was really crucial to what I wanted to do with the novel. So yeah, absolutely. I was hoping it would be, a spiral that would bring people from a very broad area down to the very intimate of a family, and then the individual level, and then move back out again into the family, into the community, into the region. kind of a symphony of voices in ways.
Greg, did you want to read an excerpt?
Yeah, I would love to. I think what I'll do is I'll read from the beginning of the novel. It doesn't require me to really set much up, given a little bit of context here. And I just want to invite everybody to kind of come into the world of the book before John and I keep talking about it. So I'm going to start with, there's a very short italicized passage that's kind of an incantation or a prologue. I'll begin there, and then I'll move into the first chapter and read like the first couple pages. What's the story of this place, this valley, this river, this bay? The story of this place? The story of this place is simple. The men take the women away, and the sea takes the men away. How do the men take the women away? Love, fists, knives, pregnancies, money, guns, words, love. How does the sea take the men away? Very, very easily. Just a little swoop of wind. The leap of a single mischievous breath. Try it. Open your lips. Press your tongue down against your back teeth. Close your eyes. Yes, sugar, just like that. Now take a breath. Make it small. Think of a newborn's lungs, no bigger than a clementine. Now take that breath. You feel it? Of course you do. There's another man gone by the sea. And what does the land do through all this? It cries out for justice. 1. We were wild kids, always covered in river dirt and sweat. In every corner of the house, one could see our passing. Ochre footprints slapped across kitchen floorboards, sand spilling from our beds, mud from our hands smeared along cabinets and door handles, and the hulls of the miraculous boats our father built. With the windows thrown open in summer to the river and the calling of owls and coyotes and wood frogs, it sometimes felt like the line between the world inside and the world outside vanished. Perhaps that's why my brothers and I never questioned our parents' ability to summon each other back from short and great distances. It wasn't until I was grown that I realized this was unusual at all. Certain cultures believe a song or chant voiced in one place can be heard in another place many miles away. Passamaquoddy people talk of motowolan, ones with extraordinary spiritual powers who can hear for great distances. All these years later, I am still convinced my parents carried some similar summoning magic. And while I don't have the language for such a thing, I know only this: love should always be able to call love back. That seemed simple enough to us as children. My name is David Almer Ames. The other day I woke with a sudden need to make sense of old things before more new things came on. I guess this isn't so unusual, but by giving myself permission to freely survey the lives I grew up among, moving from one household into another, much like the river that surrounded us, I'm hoping to stand in the flow of history without being crushed by its weight. I'm a doctor now, and while one might think I'd seen enough absurdity to throw my hands up to time and chance, the secret curse of being a caregiver is the hunger for control. Every malady has a potential cure if you get to it soon enough. So it is that I've often thought about what could have been stopped had someone gotten between my father and Limeville when I was a teenager. But I'm talking now of mystical things, of surreal places and impossible tasks. To begin the right way, we must start with the Penobscot. The Penobscot River rises from the mountains and lakes of northern Maine and runs down the state like a spine. It shares its name with the Penobscot people, who are the current and original inhabitants of the river and ancestors of the waters. The Penobscot Nation, along with the Micmac, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy tribes, were known collectively as the Wabanaki, the people of the Dawnland. For thousands of years, they'd been the first people here, until, as prophesied in the visions of elders, ships filled with white faces came from the east, sowing impossible sadness. It was in the east as well that healing was supposed to start. The Penobscots ran their nation from a mile-long island rooted in the river, and their ancestral territory included the entire watershed. The river, its waters, its banks, its islands, and Penobscot Bay, which over time had become my family's home as well. 30 miles downriver from the tribe's island reservation, a small tributary took one final detour through the woods and around our house before rushing into the sea. As kids, we called this artery the Little River because it felt like ours. Of course it wasn't, but we were children and didn't yet understand the danger of thinking land was something one could own. Down in the woods, a narrow peninsula jutted into the waters. My parents, Arno and Fallon, built a long dirt drive out to the peninsula's end, then cleared just enough timber to frame a small post and beam cape. Salt pulled down from the nearby sea permanently colored the dirt, and the drive was as hooked and white as a human rib bone. Dogs we owned spent hours out there licking the earth. During big storms, we thought the entire peninsula would wash away, and we considered retreating to town to stay with friends or relatives. Stubborn, stalwart, deeply rooted to the bottom of the river, the land remained, and so did we. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Greg. That was great.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Another thing, and it came up a little bit in that reading, is I keep coming back to some other things you say in the book. You have a quote in here that says, "A childhood is a bit like a forest. You enter the world, and the trees and stones and creeks and bright spots and dark corners are already there waiting for you." A lot of the book is about, you're born into this world. You don't really get to choose where. To me, at least, this is what I got out of it. It's just, you're born into a place and things are already set for you, right, physically, but as well as in your family relationships. There's almost a sense of predestination through the book and people trying to break away from the inevitable. Without giving anything away, is there anything you can expand on that a little bit and how that plays into the main characters in the book?
Yeah, I absolutely can. And I'm glad you mentioned that passage, because it's one of the passages in the book that always felt most true to me as a young person growing up in Belfast and having this long history with the state. I felt very much kind of in the flow of something that was a little inevitable and that times was out of my control, which isn't always a good feeling, right? To just kind of be in this pattern, in this cycle, in this place, and not knowing how you can, not only not knowing where you fit, but how you can find a way to navigate somewhere else. So one of the things that passage then, it goes on a little bit further, and I think David talks about how one of the things that's been predestined or predetermined are these very adult worlds that kids come into, and that includes the conflicts that adults carry with them, and some of those are like generations long. So throughout the book, many of the characters, and David, the narrator in particular, are kind of faced with this question of how do we trade a cycle that we've seen play out for generations and generations and generations. We see this in small towns and rural areas. They're often a cycle of resentment or harm. It could be harm to the land. It could be harm to other people. Both things happen in this novel and have happened in Maine's history. And sometimes that cycle of resentment is feeling like one group or one class of people has more opportunity than the class that you're born in or the cultural group that you're born in. So you kind of are set up to hate them or to be resentful. So how do you change these patterns for, the embracure of like a life of compassion and empathy towards all the various groups and all the things that make up a community? So that was something that I wanted to explore in fiction, but both because like that's key to my experience of growing up in small towns and what I've seen in small town America. And also I think like what we see happening in our country at a really like heightened, intense level right now. All of these cycles of harm, we know that hurt people continue to hurt people, are like there's an attempt to reckon with them and also break that cycle and start something new, which is the hardest part. I mean, part of the battle is like acknowledging the cycle and being able to see it in your family, your community, or your area. And then once you can identify it, how do you redirect it? And it takes a tremendous amount of work to do that. But it's definitely like at the heart of what I wanted to explore in the book, because I think it's maybe the most pressing thing like facing our country at its core.
Yeah. There was I had another quote written down, and if I can't find it, I'll move on. But you do say later in the book, and again, I'm not giving anything away, but that second chances were one of the great American lies. Some people come through damage and arrive at wholeness, while others come through damage into more damage. It kind of, like you were talking about there, describes a lot of what's going on in our society now. everyone at one point or another through some point in their life has gone through some kind of trauma or some kind of hurt, and it's kind of how you deal with that. But also the society that you're living in and your place in society kind of determines where you go from there as well, because it's more like some people don't get a second chance with things, and
Absolutely.
that comes out with the various characters in the book, because some, do get a second chance based on where they are. But then talking about the mill fire, which is a plot point in the book, but if it's on the book jacket, I don't think it's much of a
Yeah,
spoiler.
it's not a spoiler.
Yeah.
And I've
But
never been very worried about spoilers. Like, I think how
yeah,
and why things happen in books are always more interesting than like what happened.
yeah. But the fire is set by a Penobscot girl who knows that because of her standing in society that she is not going to get a second chance. So could you speak a little bit about that, about how
Yeah,
those cycles of violence and how they can have different effects on different people?
absolutely. So yeah, so Molly, the teenager who sets the fire, yeah, she's very aware of like how this will be perceived by the justice system. And when the justice system, I'm talking about the white European American justice system that like is dominant in the state in the book and is in our country. So if a white male teenager sets this fire, it's going to be seen differently than if a Penobscot teenager sets that fire. And there's ways that you know one character versus the other might um, not get off, but might not have to face like lingering consequences that they do. So Molly sets the fire because she's tired of seeing the mill harm the land, poison the river, poison the nation, and tired of watching people like her dad turn themselves into machines to work at the mill. Her father, the mill that she burns, it's a bankrupt paper mill that's kind of on the eve of potentially reopening. And she knows that as soon as the mill reopens, her dad's going to go right back to working there because like that's what he has to do to provide. So it's an act of protection. It's an act of ceasing something that's caused really irreparable harm in her eyes. And the only way that harm will change is if it's no longer there. But at the same time, like it carries great consequence. So after the fire is set, like Adam knows that like he can't just walk into a police station, and Molly knows she can't just walk into a police station and face like, that's just sort of like a fair kind of treatment around this. So the idea too of going to any institution is basically an idea of being completely othered and being completely marginalized even more. So they kind of go into hiding, and the hope that Adam has is that things will calm down enough where he can safely figure out what to do with himself and his daughter. He doesn't want to go like up the river to the nation. He doesn't want to bring this harm on the tribe. He doesn't want to really leave, what's his ancestral home either. So these cycles too, it's not just Molly who can't like who does an act that like maybe will continue to haunt her. Like there are non-Indigenous characters in the book as well who just can't kind of get out of the pattern of the past, and not just the pattern, but kind of the boxes that small towns put people in. Lyman Creel is an instance of that. We have a character who has done a lot of good. He's done a lot of bad things too. He's made some poor choices, and he can kind of is this black cloud or dark cloud that moves through the book. But his family had owned mills. He kind of goes against them. He takes his wife's last name when he marries, which is a fairly radical act for 1970s Maine in many ways. He chooses to become a fisherman instead of going into like the running of mills. He organizes the fishery and starts a lobster cooperative. So he does all these things to kind of bring his community together. But he's also territorial. He's violent. He responds to threat with force. And again, like Lyman's past or Lyman's kind of pariah status comes back, and that kind of being put upon in that way causes him to lash back out. So with Lyman, like the question is always, is he the dark cloud because like he's this dark individual, or is he the dark cloud because like darkness from his community keeps coming towards him? But I thought that it might be interesting for everybody to hear a little bit about, from Molly's voice. One thing I've been doing here is I have an audio clip from the audiobook version of the novel. And it's about 2 minutes long. It's a letter that Molly sends to the Lowering Days, the newspaper. After the mill burns and there's all this speculation about what happened, she sends a letter to the Lowering Days, which is the newspaper that Fallon runs, just claiming the act and saying why she said it. She doesn't say who she is, but she, she owns this action and wants everybody to know what her intentions were. So I'll mute my video and play the clip, and you're going to hear two voices here. The first is one of the narrators of the audiobook, a guy named David Aaron Barker. And the second voice reading Molly's letter is a woman named Nicole Altivator, who's a member of the Penobscot Nation and worked with me in some of the language elements on the book and narrated Molly's parts of the book. So here we go. John, we'll see if I can unmute my own video or not.
Okay.
It's a little test here. Let's see how it rolls.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to click play for everybody.
Okay.
After the fire, a letter arrived in the mail at the Lowering Days. It was written on a brown paper bag instead of dioxin-bleached white paper.
Dear readers, this paper is run by a white lady, but she's a white lady who cares. Her heart is in the right place. She gives us the space to be seen and heard. Willie Winnie. This paper has also shown it cares about truth for everyone, whether human, white, Penobscot, mountain, tree, river, or air. So this paper gets the truth. Ganudaman, Wazelmu, Nazibum, Wazelmo Thawak, Ach Nadolabamuk, Banawapskewia. Giz Abajile, Agalabamu, Wegaluke, Winila, Benawapskewia. Ada, Abajilakwe, Nij, Nawinchin to Dinana, Ada, Abajilakwe, Nij, Nalida Hasol Dinana, Nij Nichkinki, Nij Wanijke Soltina, Awenuchuk, Nagabanawapskewia. The fire I started was meant for the mill only, not to hurt anyone else. I acted alone. To the mill? This is for the river who you harmed, my people who you poisoned, and all the men and women who had to make themselves into machines to keep you alive. I think it's good you're gone. Some things have to stay dead so others can come back to life. To my people, Nudeldaman, Achi, Polita Hudaman, the river is us. We are the river. I couldn't listen to your crying anymore.
Okay. Oh, I'm back. It worked.
Yeah, that's a Zoom accomplishment that we.
Yeah, we're Zoom masters at this point. Yeah, we
Yeah.
should get a little medal from Zoom. Everybody here should actually.
Everyone gets a gold star in the chat.
Yeah, we've needed a lot of gold stars this year. So I'm happy that you're throwing them out on the chat.
Yeah. So the clip is great. Could you talk a little bit about the Penobscot language that features in the clip and how you worked with the Penobscot Nation in researching the book and kind of what the reaction's been as well? I know Nancy had a question about that in the chat, so we'll just throw it in with this that I was going to ask anyways. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really good thing to talk about. So one of the reasons I did want to play the clip also was so everybody could hear Penobscot out loud. And I knew that Penobscot is the original language of the River Valley, of Belfast where I grew up, and of Dover, Foxcroft too. So I knew that I wanted to include the language in the book. And one of the things I wanted to do with the novel was present a broader cultural portrait than we often see of Maine. We often see a very limited and a very white Maine. And sometimes we see Maine as like a vacation land too. We see a limited class portrait of Maine. So I wanted there to be kind of a multitude of class elements, of backgrounds, and of culture and ethnicity. So I knew I wanted to include Penobscot in the book, but I was only going to do that if I could get support from the nation around it. So that was important. I knew like what I wanted to say in Penobscot. I knew what the characters who used the language, Molly, Adam, and Moses, what I wanted them to say. but I didn't know how to say it. Obviously, you can do all the book research you want around kind of translation. You can look at the old bilingual copies of Transformer Tales. You can look at the Penobscot Language Dictionary, and you can kind of try to piece together, what you want to say doing your own translation work. But that loses all of the context, and it also loses, the act of having actual speakers of a language that I do not obviously speak, be present and participatory. So after I kind of knew what I wanted to say, I reached out to a few different people, and ultimately I ended up working with two linguists who are members of the Penobscot Nation and teach language on Indian Island, and a non-Indigenous linguist who teaches at USM and has helped the nation put together their dictionary, and has just been kind of a great ally in language revitalization, and particularly Penobscot language revitalization over the last 20 years. I'm not going to mention them by name just because I don't know if they want to be mentioned. They are in the acknowledgments of the book. So if anybody wants to know more about like who I worked with or who's doing what as far as language work, I invite them to grab a copy at the library, the Thompson Free Library, preferably, and take a look at the acknowledgments page.
We will have 2 copies soon.
Cool.
I've been hogging this copy the entire month, and then my wife was obviously reading it as well. It came through to me, and I mean, this is just one white guy telling another white guy.
Exactly, right.
But it came through to me that it was more than just you had Google translated the language in the book. A lot of using a language. I mean, I have 8 years of German. It's not really relevant to this, but I know things don't translate word for word. You have to almost get in the mindset of the people that you're trying to translate. And there's a lot of that, even in what we've heard so far, considering the trees, the river, everything to be people, you delve a lot into the mindset of the Penobscot. So it really came through in the book. It wasn't just you had things translated into the language. So
yeah, and to a point, fiction is always an act of imagining, and sometimes that imagining means occupying people who have lived experiences outside the experiences we've lived.
Yep.
But when you're doing that, I do think it calls for a greater level of care, for no doubt. So I am well aware of the tradition too of non-Indigenous people writing about Indigenous people,
Yep.
and how that's been super harmful at times, super appropriating, and super limited. So it was just important for me to approach this with as much care as I could and as much support as I could find. And the question that Nancy asked is a great question. Most people that, there are several people who are Penobscot who worked on the book and have been great supporters of the book. They love the book. They're singing the book's praises. And there have been people also there have also been people who haven't criticized the way the book depicts the Penobscot experience. Like, they're supportive of that. What they've had, issue with is just whether I should be telling it at all. And I have, that's a really fair point. And that's like some of the great feedback that I look for. Like, it's one thing for somebody in the Boston Globe or the LA Times or some newspaper across the country to pass judgment on what the book's doing, but it's another thing for me to hear from people who are Penobscot and listen to their response to the book, just like it's important for me to hear from people who are of small town backgrounds that are closer to my own ethnicity, my own kind of cultural makeup, which is predominantly Irish, Scottish, some Scandinavian, some Basque, some Portuguese. So I want to it's nice to hear that all the voices feel like they were respectfully captured. And for the most part, that has been the case. And I appreciate that. And one of the reasons the book took so long for me to write was, wrestling with how much I wanted to write about cultures that weren't my own, and then figuring out how to do that with the care and the research that I needed to do, but also the inclusion of Penobscot voices. I was ecstatic that HarperCollins was open to letting me have a Penobscot narrator, that they were open to letting the linguists that I worked with on the book work with the non-Indigenous narrator to make sure all the pronunciations are right. They were just super inclusive and supportive, and that was really essential, because that doesn't always happen. You don't always get a lot of say over audiobooks. You don't always get a lot of say over a lot of things in the publishing industry. So it's a spiraling answer to a really, really good question.
Yeah. Another thing, and some of this does go in, we've talked about it before, the layers of storytelling. But one of the central themes also of the book, I think, after having read it, is the importance of storytelling in general. You have another line in the book that I really liked. I wrote down the wrong page, so I apologize. I forget the exact context of it.
I may remember exactly, because I've lived with this book for so long. We'll see.
One of the teenagers gets caught lying, and instead of getting yelled at, they're told, "I'd rather sit here and beam with pride that my nephews are already starting to spin tall, shit-stuffed tales." So the character in the book is kind of saying, I just like that you're telling these tales. It's kind of like downplaying the thought of absolute truth.
Yeah.
If it throws out storytelling, could you speak to that a little bit in the book, and in general, if you want to talk about your own thoughts about that too?
Yeah, I can. Absolute truth is it's just a tricky idea in ways. So the character you're talking about is Reggie. This is the boy's uncle. It's Fallon's.
Oh yeah.
And Reggie is also kind of like one of the more eccentric characters in the book. So for him, yeah, your nephew lies and does something, wrong, tells a tale. You could like be punitive and punish them, or you could look for something that's actually creative and maybe rewarding in that. And for Reggie, it's like, hey, like your ability to actually spin a tale points to a more complex intelligence than a lot of people that I know. You're a storyteller, and if you can tell stories, you can use that to great good later in your life. So you can connect, you can relay information, you can kind of manipulate the darker side is that you can manipulate the world a little bit. And Reggie is that kind of adult figure where he's like, you're opening up a Pandora's box of a certain amount of power here. You could use it for a lot of good, you're going to use it for some bad, but I want to acknowledge that you're doing something important. Reggie's also just kind of like the uncle who says the thing that a parent never wants an uncle or not to say.
Yeah.
Of course you did that bad thing. Why not? I mean, you go for it, you go with it. But one of the things about the book that I wanted to make sure was crucial to the experience of reading it is that, absolute truth isn't absolute for any of the families. It's all kind of relevant. There's a lot of folklore and a lot of family myths that run through this book. And those stories mean one thing to one family, and then they mean like another thing to another family. So I think absolute truth is usually somewhere, but between, the very different poles of a story that families will have. And that's part of the reason that Molly sends like the letter to the newspaper is the speculation is going to be rampant. So she wants absolute truth around what she did, but why she did it too. She doesn't want confusion to exist there. If that makes sense.
Did you want to speak about some of the multiple facets of the fire, and did you have a passage you wanted to read about that?
Yeah, I've got a couple passages actually that I think I'll read, and I think they're relevant to what we've been talking about here. The first is from David's perspective, and this idea of like land being something that one can own, and that's at the heart of the start of the book. He's like, we never realized the danger of thinking that, and I don't think that like land is something we own. I think that land owns us, and like that's long been something that I've believed, and many characters in the book believe. So I want to read a short passage of David reflecting about what land means in ways. And this kind of comes to light after there has been a dispute over territorial fishing areas. I'll just leave it at that without getting into too much summary. I had always thought that land was land, water was water, an island. None were human-owned, up for occupying, raiding, or abusing. When the wind tore through the trees, I turned to the sky and tried to map the shapes it wrote into the branches. I put my hand into the damp grass in the morning and lifted it when I no longer felt thirsty. Smells were not just smells, but layers of smells, lovingly built like a painting. Twigs on top of leaves, on top of moss, on top of loam, on top of dirt, on top of root, on top of rock, on top of bone, on top of basalt. On the forest floor, I ran through time. Old leaves under new leaves, dry needles at the bases of pines. When I scratched the needles up with the toe of a shoe, gnats would whip through the light, flock to fresh scent. I slipped pine cones between my lips, pressed my ear to the bellies of ancient cedars, heard blood that I believed in beneath the bark. It was in the aliveness of the world that I knew I was alive. And the second passage that I'd like to read that kind of links into that in ways is from Molly's perspective. The fire isn't, as she says in the letter, just an act of destruction. It's an act to stop something that's been destructive. And in her view, it's kind of a corrective action. It's almost a right action, even though it's legally arson. And what she hopes is that something different will emerge and that land won't simply revert back to being a mill site, which it doesn't in this novel. I won't talk too much about how that happens, but I think if we think about a mill burning down or being burnt down in real life, like normally industrial sites are returned to industrial sites. The land, the mill is actually given back to the nation ultimately in the book. So this is Molly kind of before she sets the fire. She's reflecting on what she's done and what she hoped to accomplish by going through the mill and planting the seeds for what she hopes is a better future. She spent the summer and fall sneaking into the mill, exploring the layout, learning its topography, figuring out what would burn and how, devising a plan. Her goal was not just fire, but rebirth. At night, she peppered her father with questions about plants and gardening, and he gleefully went on and on like a man who'd rediscovered an old friend. Pushing deeper inside the abandoned mill site, she planted fire-loving seeds and seedlings wherever she thought the land would support life. She delighted in the small guerrilla act of slipping a living pocket of complex DNA beneath the earth of a hulking paper mill whose days, she was convinced, were numbered. While most of the world watched the news or dozed off, dreading getting up for work tomorrow, here was Molly digging holes for shagbark, hickory trees, and green spaces between maintenance sheds and loading docks. Even with all her planning, most days the fire seemed impossibly foolish. But when she thought about stopping, she saw that tall, aloof boy and his face theorizing to her about change. As winter set in, she began picturing the world she was trying to build after the flames. Who knew what seeds would germinate, activated by fire as plants had been for millennia, and what would pass on with the burn? Pitch pine and scrub oak and larch and willow, blazing star and wild lupin and fireweed. If they came, they would come as a tapestry of new life emerging from the ashes. And I'll stop there. I like that passage because I get to read plant names too. I always love the poetry of plant names, whether they're in English or Latin or Penobscot or French or German. I mean, there's such a beauty to plant names.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a friend and a couple people. My wife knows him, and Erica, my friend Erica's on this as well. We have a friend Acer, whose parents, I believe, were botanists and named him after the maple tree. And he's a botanist now as well. So it's kind of like a poetic justice that he's Acer.
Yeah.
Knows everything about plants.
Yeah. It's nice that it's worked. It sounds like he was set up for that and he's embraced it. Is that we talk about like cycles and being trapped by our parents and the place we come from. I mean, he was set on a particular path, perhaps in some ways, and it seems like it fits him pretty well.
It's not bad though,
No, not at all. No, yeah. I mean, I've often thought like if I wasn't a writer and an editor, that's kind of what I do for a day job. I mean, I've been thinking lately how it would be nice to just be a gardener, being a landscaper. Do something where I get to actually make money working with the earth, versus just working with the earth as a way to be inspired to write more or to avoid writing when it's not going well.
Yeah. Okay. It's about 1:45. Would you like to open it up for questions now?
Yeah, let's do that. And I invite anybody who wants to ask a question, like you're welcome to, if you can, ask to unmute and just ask me, or you can also put it right in the chat box if that's more comfortable for you. I've done a lot of virtual events this month, and a lot of them I haven't been able to see my audience at all. It's just been me and the host. So this is cool that I can see most of your faces, those of you who don't have your cameras muted. So I'd love to hear some voices if you're comfortable speaking up. I've got and I'll just call people. I'll answer one from Nancy first because it just popped up. The topic of my next book, I'm working on another novel, and I'm working on finishing a linked story collection. The linked collection is also set in Seal Point, the fictional town of the Lowering Days, and the novel is set also in Maine, but a little more to the west. I live in Casco now, and this is set more in the western mountains of Maine. Similar stories of kind of family and of myths and how they play out, and also like patterns that communities hold and pass down. So, yeah. Hi, Cindy.
Cindy, I can unmute you if I can find your name in the chat. Okay, here we go. Cindy, you should be able to unmute now if you want.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Mhm.
I feel like your wife, John, that I started the book just a couple days ago, and I was racing through it because I just loved it so much, and am so taken with the characters, and now I'm wanting to slow down because I don't want it to be over,
Thank you.
which is always, a good sign of a good read. So I'm intrigued about many things. One of which is, so many of the characters really are so close to their to the land and the land and the water that they live upon, and I have appreciated that greatly. One of the things I've thought about is how during this pandemic time, I've just been home and planted and paying attention to the woods across the road, the birds at my feeder. But I guess my question really something I'd like you to comment on is the spirituality and the connectedness to nature in so many of your characters, whether they be the indigenous people or not. And I think that's unusual. In the people around me, and maybe I'm wrong. I feel connected in that way, but the magical part, or I'd love to hear more about that, and also just how in our Western culture we tend to say, well, there's my physical being and then there's my spiritual being, and I think that's crap. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. And one other place that I marked, which had to do with Reggie talking about there are special places that are portals, where we can feel that. We can feel the spirit world more intensely, or so all of that I'd love to hear about. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you for opening up about your experience too, of kind of connecting to the woods, and that's met for the last year for you. Yeah, Reggie's talking about this spot on the river, not far under the Narrows, underneath Verona Island, if we're looking for like fictional or factual definition. And it's kind of he calls it a portal to eternity. And some places have that ability, I think, in the natural world, where they kind of stop time for us. And it's funny, like growing up, I felt always more pulled or more drawn to like the aliveness of the natural world, or maybe the magic of that world, than other people in my family did. And I thought that was interesting. Like they're, environmentalists and conservationists and great like lovers and supporters of the land, but I never saw them like just wanting to sit in the woods and linger somewhere, or really like kind of push their toes down into like the moss and feel what that felt like. So for me, I'm like, well, they love land, but they don't seem to feel it as a thing that's as alive as I do. So that made me want to slow down and really think more about that growing up. And I think that, we talk about, a lot of has been made about, the book being a book that's preoccupied with the natural world, and it certainly is, but it's also a book that's preoccupied with the spiritual world, I think, in that, that the two are directly related. So I know personally, like one of the things, there's many characters in this book where strange or surreal or kind of magical, which isn't really a fair term, things happening out in the natural world don't feel magical. They feel normal. They just feel like they're operating at a different kind of plane of existence almost. And I know I have times where I'm just walking through the woods and I'm, listening to the trees, and I'm noticing the rustle of the sound of beech leaves over here, and then the difference of birch leaves over here. and that there are times when like a gust comes over a ridge and starts shaking and moving those leaves in a way that they do sound like voices. They do sound like they're saying something. And other times where I'll walk into an area and suddenly it feels much more alive than another area. There's just an energy or a sense of something very peculiar and intense there. And I've come to kind of think of those as almost religious experiences in ways for me personally. And it's taken me a long time to talk about them too. I mean, when I was younger, I wouldn't talk much about that, because I think there's this idea of talking about the aliveness of the world and the spirituality of the natural world, where a lot of people just kind of roll their eyes. And that's partly because maybe they don't feel that, and they might not feel that because, yeah, in our predominantly Western or European American culture, I mean, land is made something that's not alive, it's not sentient. And one of the reasons I think we do that is so we can more easily extract and use land to make money. Once you start to see something as not alive, or something that's a natural resource versus like a living being, you can then harness it and harm it without as much realized guilt. I think the guilt and the harm gets internalized and comes out sideways. But in the moment, you're like, well, it's just, this is timberland. This is what it's for. Or this is a river. I mean, a river needs to actually power this mill because this is how mills work. So I'm not sure if my answer is doing your lovely question justice, but it was very much been a part of my life and will continue to be. And it's probably always going to be a part of my fiction.
Does anyone else have a question? Carol put in the chat. I don't know if you saw that, Greg.
Oh, I didn't. I'm so distracted by all these lovely faces. Like I said, I haven't get to see many faces. This is fun for me. I live in the book. Thank you, Carol, for recommending it and getting it in your library. I'm curious where your library is. If you feel like sharing, I like to know where people are coming from. Just thank you. That's incredibly sweet of you. And thank you for spreading the word. Yeah.
Cindy, I will unmute you.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what you said, Greg, about perhaps people who don't allow themselves to connect in the way that you've described. Because how could we do the damage that we've done if we really let ourselves love the environment that we're in? And just when you were speaking, I was remembering I grew up in Old Town when the mill was spewing, horrible smells every day. And so this would have been in the late 60s and early 70s. And my boyfriend, whose family all worked there, just would say, it smells like money. It smells like money. And, I know that's true. I know that people need to survive, but we make all these trade-offs that then require us to deny that part of ourselves that is really troubled by the smell and troubled by what's in the river. And so I just so appreciate you bringing it forward as the voices of, I think we might assign that kind of appreciation or way of being to Indigenous peoples, but not necessarily ourselves. So I loved that you included Fallon and her family and Lyman and his family and others in that way of embracing their environment.
Thank you, Cindy. And I agree with that. There was a review of the book in the Minneapolis Star Tribune, and it was a really lovely review. And one thing that was said in it and I'll just be candid about it, that struck me that I didn't like was, that the reviewer said, even Brown's non-Indigenous characters seem to find sacred spaces everywhere in the natural world. And there's an implication there that only Indigenous people are, connected to the aliveness of the earth and only have sacred places, which is kind of like a bit of a micro racism in ways. We won't get into that. It's reducing Indigenous people to like a certain stereotype. But yeah, absolutely, people of, whether it's Irish American descent or whether you're English or British or any European lineage that has come over here, and we're going to be connected to the earth. Like we're all connected to the earth. And if you look at the mythologies for all these European cultures, I mean, they're very much land-based mythologies too, in many ways. So I just thanks for noticing that and saying that. And I get it with a ton. I mean, I grew up in Belfast, and I was born in 1982, so like the poultry industry was kind of on the way down, but like it was money. I mean, yeah, the bay was filthy and there were feathers all over town, but you know, it was money. That's what people did. People worked for the chicken factories, and I watched as Belfast kind of traded that history for the history of MBNA. And both my parents ended up working for MBNA for many years because they needed jobs, and MBNA came with jobs, and that was another kind of like deal with a certain type of corporate devil in ways, right? We're trading one thing for another, and we're saying MBNA is better because they're not polluting, but they're certainly not supporting like a lot of land rebirth in ways. But I see some other questions here. I love the Paris Public Library. That's fantastic. Spend a lot of time out that way. Thank you, Erica. I'm so excited to hear that the conversation has been interesting and that you want to go read the book now. That's always like really touching to hear. And I hope we didn't give too much away. My publisher is always like, don't give away too many plot points. And I'm like, well, I'm just going to talk and we'll see what comes out. So,
they're not going to have to buy the book after listening to this talk. So
yeah.
No,
you know, that's fine in some ways. I mean, buy the book. I would love it if you bought the book, but if you don't want to buy the book, I'm not going to be like, I can't believe you didn't buy the book. Kazia, John, Kazia, thank you for being like one of those super slowing down readers. Like I envy that because I almost never do it. I'm always in the middle of a book and I just want to slow down, but I just kind of the momentum pulls me through. Balance it with research and creative process. That's a great question. I find that sometimes you get to a point where you need a break. Like you're working on a scene and you're working on invention and you're working on building characters and you've just been deep down the wormhole and you've been living with imaginary people, much to like the chagrin at sometimes of the real people in your life. You know, you've gone days without contributing to doing dishes and your daughter's like, you forgot this again or you forgot that again. And you're like, oh yeah, I need to be more present because I love being present with the people in my life. And maybe I need a break from like that deep imaginative space. And I find that when I'm getting or feeling that, I'll kind of transition to research. And in some ways, like they occupy different parts of the brain, obviously. And what I find with research is, as I start to discover how something would work, like if I'm researching, okay, so a mill is going to burn down. How does one burn a mill down? How do you figure that out? And how would you actually lay out the reemergence or germination of new seeds? So if I'm going down that kind of research path, I'll invariably find something that's interesting that the character who I'm researching this for, in this case, Molly, would pick up on. So the research starts to inform character, and research is often a break from character building at times. And I think too that with this book, a lot more research was required than most things I've written. There's just many elements that I had to do research on. And I don't think I could have like written the book even a few years ago because I hadn't quite learned how to reach out to people in an effective way. Now it's like, you know, it's fun for me to just cold email a professor of environmental justice and be like, hey, will you talk about eco-terrorism versus eco-defense and, you know, what language is used and then how different acts have been perpetuated and perceived. The other part with research is most of it is for me at least, I kind of try to imagine the act and then I write it and then I go back later and research to see if I got it right. You mentioned the aviation and stuff. Like I'm not a pilot, but I'm like, I can maybe imagine how flight or planes would work. So I'm going to try to do that. And then I'm going to consult with experts to kind of verify that. But it's fun. It kind of allows you to shift like the tone of your workday in some ways.
I think Greg Bobby had a question earlier. Do you still have a couple minutes? I don't know.
I do. Yeah, I'm happy to take a few more minutes here.
Okay, I'm going to unmute Bobby, and Bobby has a question for you.
Okay. Hello. Okay. First off, I apologize. My video is not working, and this weird seal picture is from a project. But anyway, I was going to ask a question about Well, just in your bio and everything, the Iowa Writers Workshop, of course, is very prestigious with a incredible list of writers who have partaken of that. And I was just curious about your experience and what you think in general writers programs can give a young writer or emerging writer. As opposed to just sitting down and writing.
Yeah, thank you, Bobby, for asking that. That's a good question. I think what they can give you if you go to them when you're ready. I'm glad I went to Iowa when I did. I was 30 years old. I had done other things and I had been writing fiction on my own for a long, long time. And I knew I wanted to apply to MFA programs because I wanted to try to go somewhere where I could prioritize writing for the first time in my life. And I also, to make that happen and to look at it from a more practical lens, well, I hate that term. I was like, well, I think I might want to be a teacher. So that'll give me the opportunity to teach also, as a TA if I go to an MFA program.
Mm.
So I think, going to them at the right time is really important. And what they give you is, it's a little cliche, but they give you time to kind of figure things out, particularly a place like Iowa where, it's a studio program. And what I mean by that is, you have a workshop that you go to, there's a workshop class, and then there are some seminars that are optional. Like we don't have a rigorous academic course load you have to take. So you have to teach or to work as a research assistant, most people, in order to get funded to be there. But you have, outside of your obligations for being in a workshop and submitting critiques and helping like your peers grow as writers, you have a lot of time to write and figure out how to do things. So I think that if you're in a spot where like you really want to prioritize or try to prioritize writing fiction or poetry, and you can find a program that's a good fit for you, that has professors you're interested in working with, and that has a good funding package, like MFA programs are great. The darker side of them can be the amount of debt some MFA programs put students in. Not all of them are funded equally. So I'm a big advocate of like trying to learn as much as you can on your own and your own writing community and groups and mentors. And then if like you think you're hitting a wall, take the MFA route, because like you're never going to have the amount of time you'll have to focus on writing that you have there.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Greg, do you have time for another question?
Yeah, I can maybe wrap up with Cindy's question here.
Okay, cool.
In the chat, because it's one we haven't talked about, and I know, John, that we had wanted to talk about it a little bit. So yeah, the role of the Vietnam War and its veterans in the story. One of the things that's at the heart of the book, and Carrie Arsenal wrote a really lovely review of it in the Boston Globe, and she talked about this. It's this idea of what is a crime, and when it comes to Vietnam, like two of the characters in the book, Arno, David's father, and Lyman, the other dad in the book, they're both veterans. And Arno deserts. He leaves the war and he's a deserter. And we know that for the most part in rural towns and in places all over, not just rural towns, like that's met with a certain backlash. To be a deserter is to be a traitor, right? Because you're supposed to go and serve and you're supposed to do this thing without question. Arno doesn't. He leaves and he's like embraced and loved by his community. Lyman doesn't. He stays. He goes to Vietnam. He does everything he's supposed to do. And when he comes home, like he is kind of met as treated as a pariah in ways. But these histories get passed down to the families in the book. Arno and Lyman respond to threat with violence and with force, and some of that is because of like the trauma they experienced in war. So those are some of the patterns that the younger people in the book are trying to break. And it's just it was important for me to kind of like unpack what's the real sin or the real crime with something. Is it leaving the war, or is it actually the war in the first place? And that's kind of the question around Vietnam in the book.
And there was also the person of color who was
there's
in
Roman,
the cabin in
absolutely
East Grand, who knew he could never be treated fairly.
Absolutely. And he gets he's not going to get the second chance that Arno is given simply because of who he is and his skin color. I think that was something that John mentioned earlier, how criminal acts, quote unquote, haunt different people at different levels. And in Vietnam is, I think, something we can look at for kind of exploring how some people have been stigmatized through generations because of it, and others seem to be forgiven for some of the things that they did or that happened to them or they did or didn't do.
Yeah, Greg and I had talked about that before, and it was one of the things that came through to me as well in the book, just how Vietnam affected everyone in rural communities. Even in Pennsylvania, where I'm from, everyone either served in Vietnam or is some kind of pariah for not having served in Vietnam, and no one came out unscathed. And that's how, honestly, most wars in the country's history are.
Yeah.
The poor people, whether they're rural or inner city, end up fighting for the people who can buy their way out of it, or actually end up benefiting from the war at the expense of the working poor, basically.
Absolutely.
It was one of the things that I saw in the book as well.
Mhm. Yeah.
All right. Well, it is after 7 now. We're in overtime of the book discussion, but thank you, Greg, for coming.
Thank you for having me, and thank you
And-
everyone for asking great questions.
And The Lowering Days is out now. We will have 2 copies at the library sometime next week, so please stop in and borrow one or buy it for yourself. It's worth reading, and probably worth reading again. There's so many layers of things to get through that I could see reading it again in a little bit. So thank everyone for coming. Please
Thank
come
you.
to some of our other events that we're going to be having soon. And we'll see you all later. Thanks again to Greg for agreeing to do this.
Thank
He
you
was
all.
talking about cold emailing. I just kind of cold emailed him, and he
Oh, it's
agreed.
great. Yeah, you just you emailed me through my website, and I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
So keep doing that.
Yeah.
Honestly.
For all of you, just do things that you don't think will work, and maybe they will. So,
Oh yeah, that's like really good life advice, actually.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
Thank you,
there's a
everybody.
great lesson in that. Thank you.
yeah. Bye, everyone.